I remember the first time I bought a bunch of comic books. It was 1983 or 1984. A few children in the neighborhood, who were also very poor like us, were selling stacks and stacks of comic books, sticker books, and coloring books door to door. My mom, who had some extra money from cashing in the old glass soda pop bottles, bought a few of them. And in those books, I was introduced to pure wonder. I looked at a Flash who was dressed up like Mercury. I looked at a Green Lantern who had a very strange red and purple outfit. And I kept on dreaming, hoping, maybe in my little childlike brain, could I be a superhero one day? The sad fact was, my family came from a very poor Appalachian area. Money and class are as real there as any other characteristic that sets you apart elsewhere. Where I live now, classism is an abstract. If you get fired up about it, it's a little unusual to say the least. But back in the day, being reminded culturally, regionally, linguistically, that you were somehow different, apart, and you were at a disadvantage was just part of life for me. One thing that kept on digging at me and digging at me and digging at me was the fact that, like any little boy growing up in the 80s, I wanted all the superpowers figures and the vehicles, but I could not afford them. I remember I had to put figures on layaway. I remember one Christmas when I woke up, there was no tree, no stockings, we could not afford that. Just dollar store toys on the floor. In 1989, Batmania hit, and it hit hard. Batmania, for me, was all about hating the 1980s. Here was a rich guy, a rarity, who actually cared. Here was a cocaine white party animal, and a city that looked like a burnt-out factory, much like the city I lived in. But here's the thing, if I wanted to make a difference on the world, I could not do it the same way as Batman. I was poor, on food stamps, reduced lunch, and the blocks of Day-Glo government cheese. My mom managed money as well as she could. I had nice clothing. I saved up and learned which toy to buy based on what I really wanted. Most people can just buy something that is not really them and be okay with it. I had to learn to buy something with multiple functions and usage. I had to learn to connect with clothing and toys in a way other people just didn't. Other people who were middle class anyway. If I showed up at school with a nice toy, well, here came the guidance counselor. Where did you get it? Where did you steal it? What's your mom doing to get you that nice clothing? These were the questions and suspicions that plagued me. Questions and suspicions that plagued me. In 1990, while sick one day, my mom returned from the drugstore. She had some extra change, so she bought me an issue of Flash. I loved the Flash, but I didn't really know that much. This was post-1986, you have to understand. DC made so many changes, it was a turnoff to me. They had grown grounded and gritty, grim and gritty and sophisticated. Yeah, I preferred Marvel, more basic. You have to understand the time period, you see. This is no comment on the branding of either company over the course of their mighty histories. In those days, the go-to poverty-stricken superhero, I guess, was Spider-Man. However, by 1990, Spider-Man was a guy who was a kept man. His wife was a pretty well-to-do model and actress who walked around in lingerie all the time. It was a gigolo's dream, just Spider-Man was not a gigolo. I opened up Flash issue 44, and I was introduced to Wally West. And for me, he had become the go-to poverty-stricken superhero. This was long before Mark Waid's fantasy about the Speed Force and a character who somehow did not need money or mention it. This was before Jeff Johns retconning the character to having a secret identity once again and a day job. Wally was different. He had a public identity, but he also did not have a day job. He had no job at all. For me, the DC characters were their day jobs, and to have a DC hero without one was different. Without a day job, well, they were poor. Issue 44 of The Flash showed a character who had to do odd jobs to get by. He had lawsuits. He'd lost his lottery winnings. I gathered up as many old Flash comics as I could, going door to door, asking if people wanted to sell them to me. I looked at back issue bins over the course of several years. I found stories about Wally, a character who needed to eat to activate his powers, stricken by hunger, by starvation, exposed to the elements. And yes, writer William Messner-Loebs was not a perfect writer. There was an imbalance in the superhero campy fun and the gritty realism. It can come across now as very absurd, but for a child like me, a guy entering his teens, this was a symbol that I could probably do something that mattered in this world, and yet I could be a poor kid doing it. I had no idea how long I was going to remain poor. Turns out I've remained poor all my life. But I've always wanted to do something meaningful. Could I do it? Could I do it with no money? Not being taken seriously? Having no pedigree? I bring up pedigree because, like a lot of poor people, you're born into a poor lineage. It gives you a name, and not much else. Yes, it can probably give you love, but in terms of anything practical, you just have a name. And where I lived, your last name determined the rest of your life. Wally inherited the Flash name, and eventually he was able to trade on it. He inherited money from the Icicle, and that set up Mark Waid's fantasy drama right off the bat. The key to Mark Waid's success, I think, was not creating cool new concepts per se. It was the fact that Wally did not have to worry about money anymore, thanks to William Messner-Loebs, and the stories could soar into pure escapism. My Wally West is not the TV Wally, it's not the modern Wally, it's not the two Wallys that we have now that turn out to be cousins. My Wally is the welfare case. Now granted, you never saw Wally in a food stamp office, and you never saw Spider-Man in a food stamp office, to be fair. When you're poor, you grow a little, shall we say, eccentric about things. A bit triggered, perhaps, when it comes to how hard life is. You have to be hard to get through it. You're not as easygoing or as normal acting as the middle class. You had to take a bus, and you don't get a car that you can even fantasize remotely as the Batmobile, because you had no car at all. Years later, Todd McFarlane created Spawn, a demonic character living on the streets. That was extremely grim. But the poor people there felt like parodies. In Solar, Man of the Atom Jim Shooter wrote more parodies. and then those characters just disappeared from the book. In the late 90s, I found myself in college. I had a job that paid very poorly, of course. So I had to be really careful what I picked and chose in terms of eating, wearing, listening, and reading. I read Avengers, Kurt Busiek, George Perez. What a great book. And then came D-Man, and I remember D-Man from the Captain America comics in the 80s. And I remember when he came back and was living with a homeless community. I thought, wow, they got D-Man and the Avengers here in this opening storyline. A hero who lives on the streets, who's not some middle-class fantasy or a fantasy about American wealth. And he was treated as a joke. Over the years, we've gotten in comic books what I like to call poverty punk. We have cyberpunk, we have steampunk. Some dude on DeviantArt is trying to make Rome punk happen. But poverty punk is something I've been seeing a lot, and particularly in the Batwing comics and Green Arrow books, and so on and so forth, where poverty punk seems to be these situations in which poor people are somehow able to make these survivalist Swiss Family Robinson situations out of their existence, some sort of fantasy community. That just doesn't happen. I'm sorry. My Wally West is gone. When he inherited money, he ceased to exist for me. I'm now a person trying to hold on to a job, trying to hold on to my health and my sanity, trying to hold on to getting by. Everything I get is from the library to read. My computer right here is really old, and I got it through a program. For me, The Flash was about a guy who could outrun anything, but he couldn't outrun his station in life. He had to work with it. He had to accept it. He had to do the best with what he could. Just like all of us who grew up on food stamps. I am the Forgotten Fan. It's time for me to get lost.